Thank you for joining us again for this edition of the Frog for Life podcast. With Texas Independence Day coming up, we thought we definitely need one of our history professors and somebody from the Center of Texas Studies here at TCU here with us to commemorate the occasion. So we have Dr. Gene Smith with us. He is a professor of history here at TCU and the director for the Center of Texas Studies at TCU. And we'll get into some Texas Independence Day here in a little bit, but you've been here since 1994, so I know we have a lot of things that you'll be able to touch on with a history about TCU, but you actually went to Auburn.
I did a BA, an MA, and a PhD in Auburn.
And I read, and I don't know if I could take your personal page at TCU to be factually accurate, but I read that originally you wanted to become a veterinarian?
I did. I grew up on a small farm. I grew up in a very poor household. And I grew up on a small farm, and growing up on a farm, we always dealt with animals. I mean, we had cows, we had pigs, we had goats, and I can't tell you how many times when we had a cow giving birth, I'd have to reach in and pull the calf out because there was some issue. And doing that several times, I just thought, well, maybe I should become a veterinarian. And see, I grew up in the state of Alabama, and of course, I grew up an Alabama fan. But when I chose to go to college, I was saying, okay, I want to be a veterinarian. Auburn has a vet school. Alabama doesn't. So I said, okay, I'll go to Auburn. And went down, and of course, I tell students this story quite often. When I went to Auburn, I wanted to be a veterinarian, and my first term, we were on quarter system, so 10 weeks back then. So my first term, I was taking 4 courses, 2 of them in particular. One was a chemistry course, and the other one was called Animal Dairy Science. Ooh. And basically in that course, we sat in an arena, and they would bring animals through, and we'd have to identify them. And growing up on a farm, I mean, that was no problem for me. They'd bring a Charlemagne through, and that's a Santa Gertruda, and that's a Jersey, and all these other students. How in the hell do you know that? I was like, I grew up on a farm. I mean, that's how I know it. Well, but then the chemistry class, I was in a class with more than 500 kids, big auditorium, and I was way back toward the back. And we had the first exam in week 4 in a 10-week term, and I made a 57, and I freaked out. I was like, I've never failed anything. Oh my God, I'm going to fail this course. Yeah. Well, I had a fraternity brother. I was a pledge in a fraternity then, but I had a fraternity brother who was a Chem E major, chemical engineering. And so I got him to tutor me. And every night I'd work about an hour and a half to 2 hours with him. And he basically helped me understand this stuff and helped me get to the point where I thought, okay, week 8, we had our second exam. I took it. I made a 63. I was thinking, oh my God, I got a 60 average now. I'm going to fail this course. So in week 9, out of a 10-week term, I chose to Q out of the course, to drop it. And what I learned later, I was the first in my family to go to college, but what I learned later, if I'd have stayed in that course, I would have probably gotten an A because they curved them so much. Okay. With 500 kids in the class, yep. I was probably in the top 10% of the class and didn't even realize it. And I was like, oh my God. Well, then after that, I was looking for majors, and I was just flipping through the catalog almost on a daily basis, trying to find something that didn't have math because I'm not good in math. And now I'm thinking, I couldn't do chemistry, so couldn't have math and chemistry. And so every term, the only courses I took with any sense of regularity was Spanish and history. Well, by the spring of my 3rd year, I basically went to the dean's office to talk to a dean's advisor. And as I walk in, he's like, Mr. Smith, you can get a major in Spanish. And I just looked at him and I said, no, 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 because I'd had a course where I'd had Spanish composition, Spanish conversation, but I was taking a course in Spanish literature, where I had to read Don Quixote in the original 18th century Spanish, having to look up every 3rd word. I was like, no, 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 I can't do Spanish. And he's like, well, you can get a degree in history. I was like, okay. He goes, go up to the 7th floor and talk to the history advisor. And I was walking out. He said, when do you think you're graduating? I said, well, this is spring of my third year, next spring. He goes, oh no, you're scheduled to graduate in December. I was like,
Really?
why? He goes, well, you took a couple of classes in community college and when you were in high school, but I'd worked after my first year. I went back home and worked in a chicken plant for a summer, which was a horrible experience. But I took 3 classes in the morning and I worked from 2 to 11. So I'd had 3 classes there. And then the second year, I worked in the admissions office at Auburn. And the summer, my second summer, I was what was called a pre-college counselor. So basically with all the students that are coming in, we had sessions where we educated them, gave them tours of campus and all this stuff. And so I took classes then. So I had all these courses. I didn't realize I basically had 2 quarters of classwork I didn't realize I had. And so when I go up to the 7th floor to talk to the history advisor, he wasn't there that day. So they sent me down the hall to talk to this old gentleman. And I'd had him for 2 classes. And when I walk in, he was like, well, Mr. Smith, I didn't know you were a history major. I was like, I didn't know either. And he's like, well, what have you decided? I was like, well, I don't know. He goes, have you ever considered going to graduate school? And I was like, no, sir, I've never considered it. He goes, well, if you choose to do that, we'll pay you a stipend. I was like, well, how much is a stipend? And at the time, this was in the mid 80s, it was like $750 a month, which was a lot of money then. I was like, wow, that'll cover my rent, my utilities, and food. I was like, that'll work. And then he said, we can also cover your tuition too. So I was like, wow, really? And he's like, yeah. And basically I was like, well, okay, I'll consider this. Yeah. And he basically told me right then, he goes, well, I'll go ahead and put your application in. And I didn't even apply, but they accepted me. And as I was walking out of his office, he said, oh, the problem is you graduate in December. We normally give stipends from September to August. I was like, okay, is that a problem? He goes, well, it might be. Let me work it out. And he worked it out. Well, he eventually became my major professor because he was an elderly gentleman. His name was Frank Lawrence Owsley, Jr. His dad had been an incredible professor at Vanderbilt. He was a part of a group known as the 13. They basically wrote books about how the South made poor choices in the period before the Civil War. All right. But, you know, I graduated in December of 84. And then in January 85, I started graduate school. And it was so bizarre because in the fall term, I had courses like, I had one course called mate selection, which was a course in the College of Home Ec. And it basically, what they would teach you is how to be kind and polite to your potential spouse. And I remember taking the first exam in that fall, and, you know, I didn't study that much at all for it. And he's passing them back out, and there were a lot of athletes in that class, and there was this big football player like, are you going to curve the exam? He goes, no, I can't curve them. Somebody got a perfect score. And then all of a sudden he handed me my paper. It's like, oh crap, I'm the person who got the perfect score.
Oh boy.
But then I also had a course on technology in the classroom. And it was basically slide projectors and movie. And that was so easy. And then I had a course called Intro to Archaeology. And I take the first exam and made like a 92, but I was taking the class pass-fail because, you know, it was my last term and I was just trying to get out. And the professor called me in his office and said, well, if you if you don't make as good on your next 2 exams you made on this one, I'll fail you. I was like, wait a minute, failing is a 60 or below. He goes, well, yeah, but you showed me you can do really well, so just do. I was like, okay, and so I had to actually study a little bit for that one.
Yeah.
But you know, I went from that situation into graduate classes, and most of the people in my graduate classes were much older than I was. I mean, at the time, I was basically 21 years old going into graduate school. And I was like, I'd sit in this classroom with guys sometimes in their 30s, and they seemed so much smarter, and I just wouldn't say a word much. And it took me about 8 to 10 months to figure out, okay, I know what to say and how to say it now. So graduate school was a wonderful opportunity for me. And I'm convinced the only reason I have the job at TCU is because I got my PhD in 1991. And at the time, I was writing a dissertation on Thomas Jefferson and the Navy. And there was a professor here at TCU who was chair of the history department named Spencer Tucker. He had gotten a big grant from the Navy department to write a book on Thomas Jefferson's Navy. So I wrote him a letter and said, well, it looks like we're working on the same thing. I wrote on Thomas Jefferson's gunboat program. And he was working on that. And I said, I just want to know what approach you're taking so that we don't tread the same ground. He's like, oh, I'm doing an operational history. I said, oh, good, because I want to do a political ideological approach. And so while I was doing research, I found all this wonderful stuff that no one had ever cited in sources in the Library of Congress and National Archives. And I would send him letters that basically told him where to get the sources. Well, that being the case, he went to Washington and got some of this stuff, and it really helped his project too. Well, my first job when I graduated in the summer of 91, or the spring of 91, I'd basically, for my 4 years of my PhD program, and when I finished my master's, I actually got a non-teaching job because I was engaged to a young woman who, her dad was a state senator, and he was always like, well, you know, you need to have a real job, not an academic job. So I ended up getting a job working with the federal government, working with an organization. At the time, it was called NIS, Naval Investigative Service. Today, they call it NCIS. NCIS.
If you ever met Leroy Jethro Gibbs, I would love to. Oh, wait, he's not real.
But my first duty billet was in Millington, Tennessee, just north of Memphis. And I get there, and I was thinking, well, I want to work in contract fraud. And so I come in, and I said, well, I want to be working contract fraud. And they said, oh, we just brought someone in to do that, so you have to do general enforcement. So for about a month and a half, I did general enforcement, which was wife abuse, drug abuse, child abuse. And I just got so depressed doing that, that after less than 2 months, I was like, I'm going back to graduate school. And so I quit the job, went back to Auburn, but because I didn't have a stipend for the next academic year, I was like, oh my. Well, fortunately, I had all these people that I respected in the admissions office, the director of admissions and several other people that were high ranking there. Well, they got me a stipend through the Dean of Students office, where I was the university fraternity advisor. And I basically was in charge of 32 national fraternities and about 5,000 young men. And I kind of liked that job because I'd been in a fraternity, I'd been vice president, I'd gone to a lot of the IFC meeting, Interfraternity Council meetings, and so I understood all that. And well, in the spring, I applied for the full-time job, thinking, okay, maybe I can get that. Well, I didn't get it, so I ended up going back into history. And so my first job, while I was doing my doctoral work, I was always taking I was teaching at local community colleges, generally about 2 classes a quarter. And all the money I got there, I just put in the bank in a savings account, thinking, okay, in academia, it's hard to get jobs. So if I don't get a job, I can just keep adjunct teaching and just draw a little bit of money from there. Well, lo and behold, I got a job in Billings, Montana.
It's a long way from Auburn.
It's a huge, and climate's so very different. The culture's so very different. Well, because I had saved about $30,000, I basically was like, oh my God. And I decided I was going to go on a 6-week backpacking trip across Europe.
Okay.
And so in the summer of '91, and basically in June and July, I went for 6 weeks, had a backpack, and I just started in England, went to France, Spain, Italy, Austria, I mean, all over Western Europe. And that one experience right there did more to open my eyes to the world than anything. I mean, it made me appreciate what I do now, and makes me kind of profess to students, you have to open your eyes and know what the world is. And see, my mom had wanted to go to college, but she never had the opportunity because she grew up on a sharecropper's farm.
Okay.
And the one thing she always told me in life, and I tell this to students too, the one thing no one can ever take from you, they can take your house, they can take your car, they can take your kids, they can't take your knowledge.
Yeah.
Once you put that knowledge in, you can climb the ladder and go as high as you want. And so I did that, and unfortunately my mom passed in 2012, so I'm still kind of bummed out about it. But she kind of drove me and inspired me to become what I have become. And I know she was very proud of me, and she actually, when I first got the job out here, like I think in 1996, probably the second year or so, she came out here for Thanksgiving and sat in on one of my classes because she really didn't know what I did. And afterwards, she's like, you actually do know what you're talking about, don't you? I said, well, maybe I do. Hopefully I do. But, you know, my career has been, I taught in Montana for 3 years, and I tell you, it was just so cold up there. I mean, I moved in my apartment up there on the 7th of August, and it was 107 degrees.
Wow.
But, you know, growing up in Alabama, you had a lot of humidity. 107 up there felt like in the 80s in Alabama. I was like, well, it's not so bad. But then on the 3rd day of October, we got our first snowfall.
Okay.
18 inches of snow.
Oh, boy.
Didn't see the ground again until May. And I still tell people this, and they just kind of laugh. Every year for Easter, people would have Easter egg hunts, and they'd hide them in the snow. So they'd put like the eggs out in the snow, and that dye from the eggs diffuses off into the snow.
Okay.
So you got a green spot, a red spot, a purple spot. You don't reach for the yellow spot. You're not quite sure what that one is. But spending 3 years there, and then in the summer of 1993, Spencer Tucker, who was the chair of the department here in the history, he sent me a letter saying, we're going to have an early American history position available. I would like for you to apply.
Okay.
So he asked me to send him my cover letter and my CV, and I did, and he marked things up and sent it back. Well, then the 3 people that ended up writing letters of recommendation for me on my behalf, it was coincidental that my major professor knew the first LBJ chair here at TCU.
Okay.
His name was, the second LBJ chair. His name was Grady McWhinney. He was a Civil War scholar, but my major professor knew him personally, so he wrote a letter and called him and talked to him. My colleague up in Montana, who was named Bob Smith, he was a great friend. He knew the chair of the search committee, who was a guy named Ben Proctor.
Okay.
And Ben Proctor was one of the great historians here. Well, he wrote a letter, but then he called Ben and talked to Ben and put in a good word for me. The third guy writing a letter for me was a guy who was a professor at A&M. His name was Jim Bradford. He retired about 2016. Unfortunately, now he's got Parkinson's and he's not doing well. But I did take on a project for him back in the middle of the pandemic, and we're starting to see the first volume come out in the fall. He had done a edited version, a microfilm version of the John Paul Jones papers.
Okay.
And John Paul Jones, of course, is the founder of the American Navy. Yep. And basically they have his body interred at the Naval Academy in the basement of the chapel. And he had taught at the Naval Academy his first job, and then he got the job at A&M. Well, he asked me, he called me to come down to College Station in the pandemic. So we went down, and he basically gave me 2 boxes of paper, and it was Xerox boxes, but the paper was standing up, and it was basically 3,700 pages.
Wow. And
one was the original manuscript. He had actually sent it to a publisher in 1987, and the publisher was University of Virginia. They had accepted it. They had sent it out to review. He'd gotten the reviews back, made the changes. He sent it back in. Then they sent it out to a copy editor. This is the process of publishing. You basically get your reviews, you make your changes, you send it back in. Then they send it to a copy editor to make the language all work right. Well, they sent it to copy editors, and then when he got it back, basically Virginia told him, well, we still would like to publish it, but we're having financial problems. We can't. Oh. So they just dropped it. And so from 85, 86 until 2020, he just had it in a box. And so I went down and he gave me the box and said, can you shepherd this through to publication? And he knows, he and I edited a book series. We edited a book series. Originally it was University Press of Florida. And then we took it to the Naval Academy. And then when he retired, the Naval Academy, I didn't like working with Naval Academy Press, Naval Institute Press. So we, in the Naval Institute, basically after 5 years said, okay, we're ending the contract. And I was like, good. So it's published now by the University of Alabama Press. It's called Maritime Currents, History and Archaeology. Okay. And he's like, well, can you get it published with them? And I was like, well, I think so. So he gave me the box. One box was the original manuscript, and the other box was the manuscript that had been copy edited. So I brought it back, but it wasn't digitized. Okay. So first thing I had to do is scan it put it in a printer. So I broke it into 50-page increments, put it in the printer, and then got the PDF. Then I had a couple of doctoral students who were working on naval topics, and I got them to cut and paste the PDF and put it into Word. So ultimately what's going to happen is the first volume will come out this fall. It'll be called The Selected Papers of John Paul Jones. Okay. Jim Bradford will be listed as the editor. I'm listed as the associate editor. My 2 doctoral students will be listed as the assistant editors. But then the second volume will come out in the spring of 25, the third volume fall of 25, the fourth volume in the spring of 26. So it'll be 4 volumes. Yeah. But, you know, he wrote me a letter to the search committee, but the third member on the search committee was a colleague who retired about 2017. His name was Ken Stevens. And he knew Ken personally. So basically I had the chair of the department and then all 3 members of the search committee who all knew of me and were willing to give me a shot. And I'm convinced that's the only reason I got the job.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah, so it just worked out well. And, you know, I've been here for, this spring will be 30 years. Yeah. So it's been and a lot has happened here at TCU in that 30 years. Yeah. When I was here, Bill Tucker was the chancellor. Then, of course, in 1998, Bill Tucker retired, and we hired Mick Ferrari. And it was during Mick Ferrari's tour. He was here for 5 years. He only wanted to be chancellor for 5 years. during that period, that's when I had a dean in the school in Adran. Her name was Mary Volkanzik. She got her PhD at Texas Tech, but she had worked in Florida, I think at FIU, Florida International. And so when she got the job here, she's like, well, we need to do more outreach work. And so she sent out an email to all members of the College of Adran basically saying, are there ways that we could do outreach? And I basically came up with the idea that we create a history center. And basically, at the time, I was thinking we'll call it Texas in the World. Well, she's like, no, that's too broad. Why don't we just call it something like Texas Studies? I said, okay, we can call it the Center for Texas Studies. And she's like, okay. So we created that in the fall of 2002. It became active in the spring of 2003. And beginning that January, we started doing our first workshops. We do what the center does today. We do several different things. Basically from January through May, and then August through December, we have public history workshops that we do in conjunction with the Fort Worth Public Library.
Oh, wonderful.
And those are designed to teach people about Fort Worth, about Texas. And we've been running those for 20 years now. And for the longest, when I was the full-time director, see, now I have an executive director. When my dean retired, she had basically retired from the deanship. She went back to poli-sci, and she was able to convince the chancellor to take, when she retired, she was able to convince the chancellor to take half her salary, because she took her big salary from the deanship back to the department. They took half her salary, gave to poli-sci, and the other half to create a full-time position in the center. So we ended up hiring one of our grad students who she had worked for Texas Humanity, for Texas Park Services. And she had been my assistant director while I'd been director. And I'm still director, but now she's the executive director.
Okay.
And fortunately, we get along, and she lets me still do the things I do. Okay. But that's the first thing we did were these public history workshops, and they've gone over real well. We did exhibits. We had a big exhibit on Texas flags that toured the state.
Wonderful.
And then we had an exhibit on Texas maps that toured the state. And then right at the beginning of the pandemic, we were doing one on Texas art, and it only got down to the Whitty Museum, and then, of course, the pandemic hit, and then nowhere else. But then we also do teacher workshops. And for the center, I've raised about $9 million to make sure that everything that we do is kind of funded.
Okay.
Like we have some funds set aside where when we bring people in to do our Saturday morning workshops for the public, we give them a small stipend and we cover their travel. We do teacher workshops, and we generally do those for local school districts and for the regional districts. We've got one that we're planning right now with Humanities Texas to be here on campus. We've had a couple of Humanities Texas workshops here. But generally in those, I was able to raise the money to create a fund that if we get a professor do a teacher workshop, then we'll pay them about $600 and then cover their travel.
Oh, wow.
So, that way people aren't doing things just for free. We're kind of rewarding them a little bit. But we've also published a Texas history coloring book that was funded by the center. And the only reason we started that project back around 2003-04. There's a local artist named Darren Wright who does bronzes. You ever heard of the Sleeping Panther downtown?
Yes.
He designed that.
Oh, wonderful.
And he had it cast. But he's been a friend, and he's worked with us for a lot of different things. Well, he drew the images for the coloring book, and then our chair in Texas history, I created a chair in Texas history, and that's my colleague Greg Cantrell, and we got him to write the little captions. They're about probably 100-word caption for what the image represents. And then we had a colleague who's a friend of mine. He taught in the Spanish department. His name was Arturo Flores.
Okay.
And he did the Spanish translation. So the coloring book has an image, and then basically on the facing page, well, that'll be the image, and then on this page, I think, or I can't remember which way it is, but on the other page, there is the caption, that basically the little description of what it is, and then the Spanish translation.
Okay.
And our goal has been to try to get this in every 4th grade Texas history classroom in the state of Texas.
Okay.
And we've had some success there, but not great success yet. You know, mainly because the only reason we were able to publish it was because of the pandemic. Because at the time, you know, basically for the better part of a year, we weren't doing anything. We would offer our workshop, but they would be on Zoom. Yeah. And so people weren't traveling, we'd just give them a little stipend to help them. But then we had a lot of money left over, and the university was going to take it back. So we decided to spend it, and so we published the coloring book, and it's done very well.
Good. You spoke earlier about the work you've done. I know you've lectured some at the United States Naval Academy, and you're a proponent of military history. When you teach at the U.S. Naval Academy about military history, does that seem a little bit more important than just a regular, I'm just teaching class to teach class?
Well, you know, at the Naval Academy, I've been there on 2 occasions. I taught there during the year 2013-14, and then most recently in the year 2022-23. There, I would teach 2 classes a term. One of them would always be a survey history and naval history. And fortunately, I knew about naval history, so the first time I made the notes, it wasn't that difficult. First time I taught it, I was a little uneasy, but I taught it. But, you know, like when I taught it last year, I had all my notes from back then, and and all my PowerPoints and such. Generally in class, I don't do PowerPoint.
Okay.
I use a program, a freeware software called IRFanView.
Okay.
IRFanView. And basically what it does, it lets you line up digital images, and you bring the images up.
Oh, wow.
And see, by doing it that way, doing those digital images, students don't just get focused on what they need to write down from the image.
Yeah.
They still listen to you, and they kind of glance up at the image and, okay. Well, at the Naval Academy, I would teach the naval history, but I had to do PowerPoints. They wouldn't, because up there, they don't let you bring any other software in. They won't let you plug a flash drive in.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because they're worried about, you know, scams and such. And, well, I would generally teach course on the American Revolution, because for the longest, they didn't have an early Americanist there.
Really?
Yeah, the guy that had been early America is a professor named Craig Simons, and he was a dear friend of mine. In fact, he published his first book with Delaware. I published my first book with Delaware.
Okay.
And so when he retired, he basically retired right before I came the first time. So I taught American Revolution, and then in the spring, because it was the spring of 13-14 I was there, that's when this book came out.
Oh, yes.
This is called The Slave's Gamble. It's about slaves and free blacks and the choices they made during the War of 1812 to either side with the Americans. I initially thought it was a two-way choice, side with the Americans or side with the British. But as I researched this, and I researched it for probably 12, 13 years, I found out No, it's a little more complex than that. It's basically siding with the Americans, siding with the British, or in the South, they could side with the Spanish.
Okay.
And they could side with any of those, or they could basically run away and create maroon communities, or they could basically just try to be free on their own. Mm-hmm. Well, ultimately, because that book had come out right before I went to the Naval Academy the first time, I did probably 100 to 120 book talks in that mid-central part of the country.
Okay.
In Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like almost every week I was being invited somewhere to go give a talk. And that was a lot of fun. But because I'd published that book and I gave my talk when I went in for the interview on that book, basically in the spring they asked me to teach a War of 1812 class. Okay. And so I did that, and that was kind of cool because I only had about 7 students in the class. That's one thing nice about the Naval Academy. Generally in a class, you don't have more than 20 kids. Mm-hmm. And so in the survey classes, naval history, I'd have anywhere from 12 to 16. Well, in this class, I only had like 6 or 7. But we met in the Naval Academy Museum, and there's a conference room there. The director of the museum is a friend who actually I stayed in his basement last year when I was there because I couldn't find other housing. Well, there we were sitting around a table, and there were all these antiques in the room. It was so bizarre. Like there was an antique from the USS Constitution from the 1820s. There was one from the Peacock. I mean, there were all these wonderful pieces. The table we were sitting at had actually been given by the Emperor of Japan to Matthew Calvert Perry in 1854. Okay. When the American Navy went to Japan, and they gave him that table, and it's been and the students didn't even notice it. And at the end of class, I was like, did anybody ever take a look at that label on the side of the table? And they came around, they looked, and they were all like, oh my God, because they all heard about this. They all knew about this. Well, that class went over very well. Now, this last time when I taught there, because the director of the museum now teaches the War of 1812 class. And for the longest, he would do a cruise in the Chesapeake Bay, and he invited me up several times to give that lecture. But now, apparently, they've had some financial issues, so they don't do the cruise anymore. But this last year, I taught a course on the Revolution in the fall, and then a course in the spring was actually much like my course here at TCU called The Age of Jefferson. It goes from 1789 to 1828. Well, up there, many of the naval officers were saying, well, it doesn't do anything with the Navy. I was like, no, this course does. We deal with a quasi-war in 1798-99 between France and the United States. It was a naval war in the Caribbean. We deal with the Barbary War from 1802 to 1805, which was in the Mediterranean. And then we deal with the War of 1812. That had a naval component. They said, okay, you got to give it a different title then. I came up with the title, Building a Nation and a Navy. And they thought, okay, that works. And so we had a lot of people in that class, and that class had not been taught probably in close to 20 years there. Wow. And so the students were very intrigued with it. Yeah. But teaching there has been a real joy. The one thing I can say is that they pay me much, much more than TCU does. I mean, this last year I made close to $200,000. Wow. And it's like, wow, I can't believe that. But then again, when you make that much money, of course, Uncle Sam's going to take a much larger part of it. So I basically rolled as much as I could into my retirement.
Okay.
And it just worked out real well. But now, see, this is my military history textbook called In Harm's Way, The American Military Experience, published by Oxford. It came out right before the pandemic, but this book is now being used at the U.S. Military Academy.
Wow.
It's being used at the Naval Academy. We wrote the book primarily. I have 2 co-authors. I got the contract my first time that I was at the Naval Academy.
Yeah.
Because there they gave me business cards, and I had one that said, Gene Allen Smith, Class of 1957, Distinguished Chair in Naval Heritage. And so it looked very impressive.
Yeah.
And so I was able to get the contract with Oxford, and they said, well, are you doing it by yourself? I said, no, I'm going to get a couple people to help. And so I recruited the 2 people. One of them is, the second author is David Coffey. He did his PhD here.
Okay.
And he was one of my first TAs. He worked with Grady McQuinney, the Civil War guy. He's now the department chair at the University of Tennessee, Martin.
Okay.
And then the third guy is a guy named Kyle Longley. And at the time, he held an endowed chair at the Arizona State University. He came out and interviewed for an endowed chair we had here. And for some reason, my colleagues didn't vote for him. But now he is now the director of the War and Society program at Chapman University in California.
Okay.
But he's also the executive director of the Society for Military History, which is a national organization. And he's a great guy. But the reason I chose these 2 people is because David Coffey, doing his work here, his parents had been newspaper editors. So David had been around editing quite a bit. And when he graduated and got his first job, the former department chair, Spencer Tucker, had asked him to help with encyclopedias he was doing. So basically, encyclopedia, you have a lot of different people writing articles for the encyclopedia. Well, David would take them and make them all sound like one piece.
Okay.
Make it sound like the same person wrote them. And then Kyle, because he had the endowed chair, he had basically a summer fund. And he agreed that when we got the book ready to publish it, he would use his money to pay for the index of the volume.
Okay.
So basically, I got the contract, David made it all sound good, and Kyle got it indexed. So it worked out real well. And we wrote it. When I was writing it, I was telling him, let's write this so that kids at smaller schools can understand it. Places like Central Oklahoma, Louisiana Monroe, West Alabama. And, well, that's what we did. Of course, it came out right before the pandemic. And then, of course, that year of the pandemic probably didn't sell more than 5 copies. But then, since then, it's just kind of exploded.
Oh, wonderful.
And what we've learned is that it's used at those places I mentioned. I hear that the Air Force Academy is considering it.
Oh, wow.
But then also the University of Texas is using it. My colleague here at TCU uses it. University of Washington, Kansas State. I've heard that Ohio State uses it. I mean, all the small schools, yes, they're using it, but now also big schools are using it too. So this, probably in about a year and a half, 2 years, we're going to have to do a second edition. And one of the nice things we did in this is kind of interesting. It's got maps, but we did these little biographical or these little historiographical pieces in them. And basically explaining how, let's see here, if I can find one. But basically explaining how, in terms of, like here we have one called Issues in Military, Navalist versus Anti-Navalist.
Okay.
That was basically my first book. And so we put those little vignettes so that people can understand the historiography. And I'm sure we'll have to change those. But we added racial history to it. What that textbook has that virtually no other military textbook had. When it got to naval topics, because I taught at the Naval Academy, I made sure to put naval history in it.
Absolutely.
And then when we get to the 20th century, we have air power. We made sure to put that in there.
Okay.
So it has military history, naval history, and air power.
We said that Texas Independence Day is coming up, and I know your emphasis is military history, but we have a lot of out-of-state alumni that did not grow up in 7th and 8th grade learning about Texas history.
Right.
So
Yeah.
can you kind of share with those that didn't learn it in 7th and 8th grade in their formative years, kind of what is so special about Texas Independence Day and why it's such a big deal?
Well, it's very important because Texas, with Independence Day, basically declaring itself on March 2nd, independent from Mexico, this was going to be a major accomplishment. And by doing so, it basically said, okay, we're separating ourselves. And then, of course, 4 days later, you have the Alamo. And then 2 weeks after that, you have Goliad. And then about a month after that, you have what happened at San Jacinto. Well, all of that transpires and takes place, and ultimately Texas becomes a free and independent republic. Wanted to enter the United States, but at the time the president, who was Andrew Jackson, he wanted to take, but Congress wouldn't do it. And ultimately he chose not to submit it to Congress. And so Texas becomes a free and independent republic, and for 9 years was that. And during that 9-year period, the British, the French were trying to recruit Texas to become a part of their empires, and Texas chose not to do so. And ultimately, what was going to push Texas into doing that was basically in 1845, you had President John Tyler, who was serving, he had been basically William Henry Harrison's vice president. Harrison had died during the summer of 1841. And so Tyler became president. He began pushing for the acquisition of Texas, the acquisition of California, and also the settlement of the Oregon Territory. And basically, he was able to get Congress to vote for the annexation of Texas, not by a treaty, but by a joint resolution of Congress. The difference is a treaty has to be 2/3 Senate. A joint resolution has to be simple majority in each house. And so by doing it that way, he was able to get Congress to vote and approve it. And so by the time his term comes to an end, Congress had voted for the entrance of Texas. Texas was preparing to enter. It actually happens within the first year of President James Polk's administration. It happened in December of 45, or 46, pardon me. And of course, 45, yeah, that's right, 45. And basically, that's what's going to create the situation. But basically, Texas is one of the 3 states that did not enter the Union by the same process. The other 2 are California and then Nevada. And basically, Texas was a free and independent republic, chose to join the United States. California, basically, it had, by the time the Mexican War was over in 1848, it had more than 80,000 people. So it could petition for statehood immediately. So it didn't have to follow the same process. And of course, with the congressional debates in 1850, Congress voted to bring California into the Union. Now, the Nevada question was a little different because Nevada, there was a situation where in 1864, Lincoln was running for re-election. and he thought he was going to get beat by George McClellan, who was the Democratic candidate. And basically, he was able to get Congress to railroad Nevada into the Union because of the silver discovery.
Oh, yes.
And basically, they brought it in. Of course, Lincoln wins a landslide in '64, so he didn't need those 3 electoral votes, but he got them anyways. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that Texas is a part of a unique group of 3 and how it comes into the Union. And Texas is one of the more significant states in the Union now. People are moving here in increasing number. The economy is growing. Now, there's some questions about the leadership in the state of Texas, but those are political questions, and we won't get into those, but there are some questions about it. But, ultimately, I would say that creating the Center for Texas Studies was a way to try to promote everything that we could about Texas.
Mm-hmm. And you've shown us 2 of your books. There's a 3rd book on the table. In addition to U.S. and military history, you've also been an author of TCU history. During TCU's sesquicentennial last year, Absolutely. You published a book about TCU's first 100 years, which is 1873 to 1973. So talk to us a little bit about the process. And I understand that Chancellor Boschini reached out to you to write it, and then kind of the stories you learned about it, and just kind of what all the things you've...
leave this right here.
Perfect. Yes, tell us about what you learned during this process.
When this book, I became kind of more or less an expert on TCU because of the Center for Texas Studies. And in 2010, the center, we wanted to sponsor a centennial event on campus because that was the 100th anniversary of being here on the Fort Worth campus. Mm-hmm. And the chancellor was very supportive of it, but then he assigned us to one of his assistants, and she dropped the ball and didn't do anything. I'm not going to mention her name, but she dropped the ball and didn't do anything. And we had support from local congressmen, local senators, city councilmen, the mayor, and yet we weren't able to do anything. But I did, at that point in time, I probably did 50 presentations on TCU's history. And because of that, I became reasonably well known about TCU's history. So that's probably one of the reasons the chancellor asked me to do this book. Well, the book, the editor of the press, he basically said he just wanted pictures and captions. And I said, no. Pictures and captions, that's an Arcadia book. Mm-hmm. I said, we're going to do it a little differently. He's like, no, just do pictures and captions. So basically what you'll see here, what we did in here, we wrote little vignettes about different things about TCU's past. Yeah. The vignettes are anywhere from 200 to 400 words. Mm-hmm. And it just gives a brief kind of introduction to what those images are about. Mm-hmm. And so at the time that I was asked to work on this, I was actually working on another book that I was trying to finish up. It's a biography of a slave. And I tell my grad students all the time, don't write a book on a slave because you go down so many rabbit holes trying to find information. Well, that book is coming out later, hopefully later this year or early next year. I'm not sure yet. But nonetheless, because I was working on that book and writing on that book, basically I have a co-author here. It's one of my doctoral students who will be finishing up this summer. Okay. And I got him to work on it with me. And so what we did is and of course we were working on this in the middle of the pandemic, which meant it was hard to go places and do things. So fortunately, we were able to get in the TCU library. We're able to, because of my contacts at the Fort Worth Public Library, we're able to get in there. Contacts at the Tarrant County Archives, able to get in there. We had contacts over at UT Arlington Archives, able to get in there. But we did get some stuff from Baylor because, you know, we were in Waco for about 14 years, and then we got some stuff from the University of Texas. Well, as we got these images, you know, we decided to write these little vignettes, and we kind of created a list of the vignettes that we thought we should write on. And a lot of them we chose, some of them we added different ones, and we cut some out. Mm-hmm. But basically, the way we designed it, we kind of did a design ourselves. We put it into Publisher. We had a vignette in a box that covered one side of a page, and then the rest of the page, 2 pages, were images. And the editor of the press didn't like it. He thought we had too much writing in it. I sent a chapter to the chancellor, and he loved it. Yeah. He's like, "Oh my God, you're telling great stories here." Mm-hmm. I was like, "Okay." I said, "Just tell the editor of the press." And he did, and so we were able to do it that way. But then, of course, when we sent it in, we sent the publisher version, but all the data and images, well, they sent it out to a designer who designed it a little differently. But, you know, it's still a nice book. But I can tell you that TCU's history is one of the most significant of an educational institution in this country. It is literally the first co-educational institution founded west of the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. And it is one of the first schools, not among the first, but it's one of the first that was bringing African American students into its student body. Mm-hmm. I mean, we started seeing African American students starting to attend here during the period of World War II, really? The early 40s. Basically, they were studying in our graduate program and in our divinity school. And there were places off campus that the instruction was taking place, but we were providing that intellectual opportunity for them. Well, since then, you know, we are a much more diverse campus. And I think that's one of the benefits of what TCU is. Mm-hmm. My biggest fear about TCU is that the tuition keeps going up. Mm-hmm. And I heard on the news recently that tuition at TCU is higher than Harvard University. Well, if that's the case, that's not really advisable, because, you know, it's just not the situation. We need to make it affordable that most kids can attend. Mm-hmm. And I know we provide assistance for local students that are Hispanic and African American and poor whites so that they can attend. Well, we need to make it available to as many students as we can, mm-hmm. because I'm a firm believer, as I mentioned earlier, you've got to put that knowledge in your head to climb the ladder.
Absolutely. So. Is there a favorite story or something maybe people, you know, a lot of people have heard about how TCU moved from Waco to Fort Worth, but is there a story or a period of TCU history that maybe people don't know that you think is just fascinating?
Well, I think the period of World War I is very intriguing.
Yeah.
One of the things I point out in this book, there was a plane crash on campus.
Oh, yeah.
And it basically crashed into the north end of what is now Reed Hall. Mm-hmm. And basically what had happened, there was 3 British air bases in this area. The one that was closest was actually in present-day Benbrook. Okay. And there's a monument out there to it. Well, pilots would fly in their training, and at the time there was not much in southwest Fort Worth. TCU kind of stood out because it sat on a hill, mm-hmm. and there weren't a lot of trees around then. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in Alabama, and there's lots of trees there, yeah. So I miss trees. But they would fly over TCU because it became a reference point. And ultimately, pilots, as they fly over, they started seeing young women down there. So they started flying lower to look at them. Oh. Well, a pilot on a day in 1917, March of 1917, I think it was March, I can't remember the exact date now, but he was flying low, and he wasn't able to raise the altitude of his plane anymore. A cable or something had snapped, mm-hmm. and he basically, in front of Reed Hall, his left wing hit the flagpole, knocked the flagpole down. But as it knocked the flagpole down, basically what happened is the plane tilted around. And as it tilted around, it was still moving. So it ran into the north end of the building.
Wow.
And knocked about 20 feet of brick off the building.
Oh my goodness.
And at the time, the north and south end of Reed Hall had revolving doors. There were actually some girls in that revolving door, and fortunately, they didn't come out, so they didn't get hit.
Yeah.
The pilot was okay, and by the end of the day, the crews from Benbrook had come up. They had recovered the plane. They begun stacking up the bricks,
Yeah.
and they would help with the repairs of it.
Wow.
But that was the first plane crash on TCU's campus. Later that fall, the TCU football team was playing the football team from the air base.
Okay.
And they were playing here on campus. And ultimately the air base team beat TCU.
Mm-hmm.
And as a pilot was taking off, he was taking off down what is, I can't remember the name of the street between the parking lot and UCC Church. But
Canty?
Canty, yes. He was basically going down Canty because it wasn't a street then, but
Yeah.
he was taking off there. And as he was beginning to fly up, his wheels hit a barbed wire fence and his front end went down into the ground.
Wow.
And all these people from the game came out and they were kind of scowling at him and looking at him. Well, again, the crew came up and they got his plane and he wasn't hurt.
Yeah.
But the fans weren't happy because their team had gotten beat.
Wow. And you've seen, being here since '94, you've seen this campus change a lot. You know the history of TCU's construction throughout the years. Whether it's a current place on campus, a place maybe you've researched, a place you used to go to, what would you say your favorite place on campus is?
Well, obviously my favorite place on campus is my office.
Well, there you go.
And the reason, because prior to 1959, Reed Hall was where the chancellor was, the dean was. My office is actually where the dean's office was.
Oh, wow.
And I am the second faculty member in that office. The first one was Ben Proctor. Ben was a wonderful guy. He hired me here. He was here from like the 54 to, I think he retired in 2010 or 8. And I moved into the office in 2010. So I've been there for quite some time now. But I find that I like that office. But you know, there's lots of things about TCU that kind of surprise people. For example, when you look at the campus now, you see buff colored brick and red tile roofs. Why do we have red tile roofs?
I'm not sure.
Well, it happened during World War II.
Okay.
We were starting to build a dorm called Foster Hall, and during the war, you couldn't acquire petroleum. Petroleum was in short demand.
Okay.
And so you didn't have many shingles being produced out of petroleum.
Yep.
So basically they had to come up with a different roofing type.
Okay.
So they chose to go with red tile roof. And that became kind of the standard from that point on. And many of the buildings have now been renovated to have those red tile roofs.
Wow.
And some other things that's kind of interesting about campus. You know the first building that was air conditioned on campus?
Was it Reed Hall?
Nope.
No, not where the chancellor was.
Nope.
What was it?
Langdon Hall.
Langdon Hall.
Is late 50s.
Late 50s?
Yep. And by the time they built Sadler Hall and the chancellor moved in there, it was air conditioned.
Okay.
But then another thing that I always find kind of interesting here on campus, you know, you walk by a building called Colby Hall. What's Colby Hall?
It's a girls' dormitory.
Well, it is, but who's it named after?
I'm not sure.
Named after Colby Hall.
Oh, really?
He was one of the first quarterbacks on TCU's football team.
Oh, wow.
And he later got a Master's of Divinity and a Doctor of Divinity, and he taught here at TCU and was Dean of Students at one point in time.
Wow.
Yeah, his name is Colby Hall, and yet it's named Colby Hall, and people are like, who's Colby? Well, that's his first name.
Wow.
But that's one of the interesting stories. You know, many of the changes I've seen on campus, when I came here, we were just starting to build a lot of new things. Mm-hmm. For example, the dorms behind Sadler Hall, those were just being built. Mm-hmm. And then the new business school buildings were being built. So when I first came here and people called it TCU, they basically referred to it as Texas Construction University.
Yes.
Because we were always building something. And I think the only time we really slowed down or stopped was during the pandemic.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's a very different situation now.
Absolutely. And these stories are fantastic, and we can go for 6 more hours, and I would love to. But every history professor, I feel like we need to ask this question to close. If you could have dinner with any 3 members from any era of history, what 3 members of history would you have dinner with?
Well, because of my interest in early America, I would probably choose George Washington, because I'm writing a book on him now. I'd probably I'd probably do Thomas Jefferson, because I've written several books about Jefferson. And probably the third one, I'd probably try to find someone really wealthy that could endow me a chair.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, yes, please tell us where we can get this book.
This book, you can get it at the TCU bookstore. You can order it on Amazon.
Absolutely. So support Dr. Smith and all the efforts, and you can learn all the fun factoids about TCU.
Oh, there's some great stories in here, too.
I can't wait to read it. It's going to be, I didn't know there was a Mr. Colby. I just thought, so now you learn about Colby Hall.
Well, and if you look for another book, this is a great one to read, too, because it tells you about America's military past. Fantastic. But I have 12 books in print and 3 more coming out, so you can Google me very easily and find all my books at Gene A. Smith, TCU, and all of a sudden you'll have a whole list of sites that pop up.
And there you go. And now you'll have your fun factoids to tell at all your parties and family reunions.
That's right. Tell at your parties and entertain people.
Well, have a great Independence Day, alumni, and go Frogs. Go Frogs.